Got a few trickling in, but it's time for us to get started. Not sure if my mic's on, actually. Nothing?
I don't know, I can hear you, but I'm right here.
Yeah. Testing. I don't think this is on. Nothing. Oh, you can? Okay. That means they're just ignoring me. No, okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Okay. We're working on Judges, and we are in, well, the last bit of chapter 6 before we go to chapter 7. We're talking about Gideon. And Gideon is quite an interesting little story for us. Following our trend, the judges are getting worse. The portrait of Israel is getting worse. We are declining in faith in general. But we noted last week that so far in the story, Gideon is showing some Moses-like vibes here. He is first showing a lot of hesitation. He needs a lot of help from God. He needs a big push to actually go and do what he's supposed to do. But he's on an upward trend. And so at this point, it's hard to be too hard on Gideon because he is at least progressing forward. That is going to continue through chapter 7. And he's going to look very good through chapter 7. And then things are going to get a lot worse. So in chapter 6, question number 8, how does God build Gideon's faith from that last little section in chapter 6? What is it that Gideon asks for? Yeah, Gary.
He asks for a miracle, actually.
Okay. Now, hasn't he already gotten one of those? He has, in that he brought that offering to the angel, and he's been shown that the fire came from the rock and consumed the offering. But he needs some more reassurance. He needs some more help, and so he asks, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said," and then goes into this whole thing about putting a fleece on the ground. And the first way he does it is, if there's dew on the fleece and the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand. And so he wakes up early the next morning, and what does he find? The ground is dry and the fleece is wet. So exactly as Gideon asked, this is, I think, remarkably gracious of God to indulge Gideon in this way, because now Gideon is saying, I want another miracle, and I want you to do it in exactly the way that I am dreaming up, which is kind of entitled in some ways, but hey, he is already building faith and on track to deliver Israel, so God is willing to indulge him and to show him that, yes, I really am going to save Israel by your hand. So to prove that the fleece really was wet, he picks that up, he wrings it out, and he's able to fill a whole bowl full of water. However, and I think maybe this is what comes into Gideon's mind, if you have dew on the ground and you have an absorbent fleece that's there, what's going to dry up first? Yeah, the ground dries. And the fleece is going, it can take a fleece a long time to really dry. And so maybe that could happen naturally. And so Gideon asks for it to happen in reverse. He says, let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test just once more with the fleece. Please let it be dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground let there be dew. So now we'll do it in reverse. The ground needs to stay wet, and the fleece needs to be completely dry. And somehow God still indulges Gideon. He is very gracious, very patient with him here, which shows, I guess, just how much God wants to work through Gideon and is willing to be patient with him so long as he is seeking God. And so, yeah, Gideon wakes up the next morning, and it was exactly as he said. The fleece was dry and the ground was wet. And so now he has proven, yes, God is really going to be with me. I can go and conquer the Midianites. So this is now in one chapter. Gideon has gotten 3 miracles, 3 signs from God that God is with him. Victory will come by his hand, and he should feel confident to go fight the Midianites. You have anything else you wanted to bring up in chapter 6 before we go to chapter 7? Yes, Dave.
I want to get your thoughts on, typically, God has always done the, what's the word I want to say punished, but let's use that word, for doubting him. Is really here, he's dictating to God,
Yeah.
not the other way around. He's unsure of himself. Okay, I understand that. Like Zechariah, John the Baptist knew
Yeah.
for doubting him. So I'm just curious why. I mean, he's got a battle coming up. Let's see next chapter, but I'm curious as to why. There's a different play out on this. You got any thoughts on it?
Yeah. I'm curious too. No, I think there's something so if you didn't hear Dave's question, he's saying, Gideon's showing a lot of doubt here, and he's dictating to God what God should do and how he should do it. It is pretty entitled and not really showing a lot of faith. So why is Gideon not punished in some way? Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, was struck mute for doubting. Sometimes other people were even killed for their lack of faith, for their rebellion against God. And Gideon honestly is treating God more like Baal than he is the God of the universe. He's kind of doing this bargaining thing with him and telling him how it is that he should do things. I think that God can recognize the potential in people and know when, yes, there is great weakness, but maybe there is opportunity for that faith to grow. And Gideon is about to face a very hard battle. He's about to have to do something that requires a lot of faith. And so God is kind of putting this into overdrive for Gideon to get him prepared and ready. You see some of that same thing with Moses. There's a lot of parallels between Moses and Gideon, at least at the start. Moses was so hesitant. Moses didn't believe that he could do it, kept making excuses, and outright told God, no, I'm not going to do that. And somehow God was still patient with him. And God, in his mercy, is able to recognize when we are very, very weak, and when we need a lot of help, when we need a push to get going, and when we might even need more than we are really entitled to show that he is with us. So that's God's judgment on the matter. It works out for Gideon here. It works out for Moses as well. Others, maybe there wasn't really as much of a glimmer of that faith and that potential there. Mark?
Yeah, he opens up this dialogue, questioning God about what he did, bringing them out of Egypt, making reference to those sorts of things that were miraculous.
Yeah.
And what is more important, or what is more prominent, putting dew on the ground for somebody and then on the fleece, or Jesus Christ, who God sent for us, for a sign? That's a forever sign for us.
Yeah.
He knows that we need these kinds of things to bolster our faith.
Yeah. I think it's a little bit like the question of why was Jesus so patient with his disciples in answering some of the same questions over and over again, in dealing with some very selfish attitudes, some very strange priorities that they had, and just we look at them and go, man, your head's just kind of thick here. You're not getting it. What is wrong with you? Jesus was so patient with them, whereas sometimes he didn't even answer the questions that others asked him because he knew that they were not asking honestly, that they were not trying to seek him. They were only there to test him. God is able to make that sort of assessment of a person and to know why it is that they're asking something, to know the difference between even extreme weakness, extreme lack of knowledge, versus outright rebellion. And it seems at this point, Gideon is not at outright rebellion. He's just at a very, very weak faith. That being said, like we noted last week, we can say Gideon has a really, really weak faith, but he did pull down his father's idol. So you got to give him some credit. He did do a hard thing that God commanded him to do. So he is a complex individual, like we are all complex individuals. We have good and bad moments. We have tendencies that we're trying to stay away from, and we can really shine in some moments. Gideon is showing a lot of that same thing here. Anything else in chapter 6? Chapter 7 is great. Chapter 7 is going to be very upbeat and positive, very victorious. There's a lot of good happening here, and I just really, really wish that the story ended in chapter 7 so that it could end on that positive note. I keep foreshadowing this because chapter 8 is just such a hard fall for Gideon, and this is a turning point in the book of Judges that we see a judge fall so hard, but the fall is more meaningful and more important when you see just how well Gideon was doing for a time. So question number 1, now I'm next lesson with chapter 7. Question number 1, Gideon has assembled his army and they're going to fight Midian. What is the problem, and why does God say there are too many people? Dave.
First thought coming to mind, I can't speak real loud, sorry. Maybe you can repeat it. Is that, as God says, it's too many for me to deliver them into the hand of Midian. First thought comes in my head is that he didn't want them to think that they were the reason they conquered.
Yeah.
Guys, it's God doing this. And so I'm just speculating on this, but I can't. It's hard to. Maybe you just show God wanted to show everybody who was doing it.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, that's the only thing I come up with that they don't get prideful in it.
Yeah.
Assume it was all because I'm a mighty warrior.
Yeah. I think you're right, Dave. That Dave's saying this is that God's saying there are too many people to fight, too many soldiers on Israel's side, and we need to whittle this number down because I need you to know that I am the one who gave you the victory, not by your own power, not by your own fighting force. And I think this is similar to what we saw in Joshua, that God wanted them to know the victory comes from him. And in Joshua, he didn't reduce their numbers like that, but in some of those battles, he had them executing very non-military strategies, like marching around Jericho and waiting for the walls to fall by God making this happen. And then rushing in, then finishing the victory themselves. A lot of the battles we saw in Joshua were God sowing confusion in the enemy's ranks, or God using a hailstorm or a flood of a river, these sorts of things to show that it's God who's bringing them the victory. And the Israelites still had to fight, absolutely, but it's God who's giving them the victory. Same sort of thing here. God wants them to know the victory does not come from you. Now, what I find really interesting about this is you almost imagine that when God says this, that the Israelites and the Midianites have maybe equal armies. And so they could say it's a toss-up, it's our power, it's our expertise and our skill that allowed us to get this victory. It's not even remotely equal. So Israel started out with 32,000 people in their army. And the Midianites, it doesn't say here, but it says down in chapter 8, verse 10, the Midianites started out with 135,000. So 135,000 versus 32,000. I am not a military strategist, but that does not sound like that the Israelites have too many men. They're already vastly outnumbered. We already know that they are not as prepared to fight. They don't have as many weapons. They don't have the kind of technology that some of the people around them do. They are not, nobody's going to look at that and go, oh, the Israelites are definitely going to overpower the Midianites. Not in the least. So for God to say, you have too many men, seems indulgent in the sense of, like, how few do we need to make this army to show that the victory really comes from them? And I say it's indulgent, but it's really not, because we're going to see in chapter 8 that Gideon does take credit for the victory. Even after all that God does to whittle the numbers down, Gideon takes credit for the victory in the end. And so the lesson is not learned. And God is totally justified in doing what he's doing here, because Gideon looks like a fool in taking credit for it, and the whole population of Israel goes right along with him. This is how far that they are fallen. So that's the problem. That's why we have too many people. God's going to work on getting that number down. How does he get the number down? Okay. First step, if you're afraid, go back home. That's actually a fairly practical thing to say, right? Probably most armies are okay with that sort of thing. Either you got to get everybody on board, you've got to bolster their courage or threaten them to make sure that they fight and not surrender, or you say, if you're too afraid, go home. Now, the Israelites don't really have the luxury to be just dismissing troops, but this is what God wants them to do. So out of the 32,000 that they start with, how many go home? 22,000. That's not a good sign. That's a large number. That's not a few cowards. That's not a few people who you joined on a whim and now aren't really sure. Like, that's 2/3. That's more than 2/3. That's a large majority of the army that says, I don't want to fight Midian. If I have any excuse to leave, I'm going to leave. And so now we're down to 10,000 men. And God somehow, inexplicably says, you still have too many soldiers. And I want you to try to picture in your mind what 10,000 soldiers looks like against 135,000 soldiers. It doesn't seem like that's going to work at all. Yet God says, you got too many men. So what is phase 2 of getting the numbers down? Okay. Yeah. So go drink some water, have the men go down, and the way that they drink water is how we're going to divide up who stays and who goes. So you have some people who knelt down, on their knees, get their faces down to the water, and they're drinking that way. Whereas you have some who are scooping water up with their hands and then lapping it out of their hands. And God says that latter group, they're the ones who are going to fight. All the ones who get down on their knees and put their heads down into the water, they are going to be sent home. So, the question then becomes, is this arbitrary or is there a reason behind it? Yes, sir, go ahead.
We say there are 12 tribes of Israel, and there were really 18. And one of our tribes is Benjamites, with the left-handed archers. Today, in our naivety, we have SEAL Team 6, and the 6 represents the 6-pointed star of David. In order to get into the Navy SEAL Team 6, you have to have one on your body, which I do. And some of us are more capable of violence than others, especially as an archer. And you won't believe how many arrows I can shoot in 2 minutes. Well, there are other Israelites here that are not capable of even going to the battle And I would just as soon them go home if they're not going to present themselves as warriors. And which is fine, because, you know, Gideon's letting these people leave. It's only the bravest, ones that are the most valiant, the ones that are capable of committing violence, should even be on the battlefield in the first place. There's some of them should stay in the back and be doctors prepared to help us if needed.
Yeah, so Gideon, yeah, he's getting the core group of people there who are ready to fight, who are, I guess, the most capable and the most willing, but then the way that God has now chosen, because it's God who's doing this choosing, through how they're drinking water. You know, I think your question kind of becomes like, is that an arbitrary choice, or is it something about how they're drinking the water? And I think you can make the argument that it's something about their awareness, their ability to look around and to still know what's going on around them and to be prepared. So if you've got your head down to the water, it's a little harder to be aware of anyone who's going to be sneaking up on you, versus if your head is still up and now you can be lapping out of your hands, you still can be looking around and seeing if there's any problem. That being said, like, there are other ways to determine like who is it that's going to fight. You can say, okay, we got all the cowards to go home. God could now say, okay, Gideon, go and pick the 300 most accomplished soldiers in the group. Go pick the ones who have the best skills. Go pick the ones who have the most experience in fighting. Those are the sorts of things that that any military would do. If you have some sort of reason to want a smaller group, which you might for a certain kind of operation, you're going to hand select those people. God is hand selecting people, but in a little bit of a strange way. To me, what is more evident is not that God is picking the 300 most suitable soldiers, but more that God is just cutting down their numbers in general. And it's going to be 300 people who go to fight, and that they're still going to have victory because God will give them the victory. You got any thoughts on that? I know there's...
The point is it's God.
Right, yes. 100%. The point is this is God. And even if it's the 300 best men in Israel, which it might be by this point, it may be the 300 best soldiers, best fighters in all of Israel, that's still really not sufficient to go fight 135,000 people. Like, that's absurd. This is a Midianite army that is fearsome, that for 7 years has been oppressing the people of Israel. They've been causing a lot of trouble. This is not something that they're going to easily be able to defeat, especially when you throw a few hundred men into battle against over 100,000. Yeah, John.
Do you think there's people that want to like stay and fight, even if they're told to go home, or does that really not matter?
Well, I think so, possibly. If not then, at least later, once it becomes clear that they're getting a victory, more people do join in who weren't even part of Gideon's original group. So once they get some momentum, things start changing. Out of this original 32,000, I don't know if some of those wanted to remain. Obviously, the 22,000 who were too afraid didn't want to fight. But out of the other, 9,700 people, did some of them wish they could stay? Maybe so. There's glory and honor in fighting. There's, they believe in the cause of trying to rescue or trying to deliver Israel. Then missing out on that opportunity is kind of a hard thing for them. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the weapon that they were given wasn't the swords and the arrows, though. They were given a trumpet and a pitcher with a lamp in it.
Yeah.
And they were to blow it and break the thing, and they stood in their place.
Yeah.
So it caused confusion in the Midianites' army and stuff.
they start killing themselves.
Yeah, this is going to be a very strange military strategy here, and it's not, like I said, even if it is the 300 best soldiers in all of Israel, like, they're not really acting like soldiers in a lot of this. They will, as it progresses, but they're not really operating as a military at the beginning. They're operating as people who are calling upon God to give them victory, and that's the point there. Alan?
Yeah, I was just going to amplify that by saying this isn't the first time God has done it this way, in that, against incredible odds, the victor is the Lord. And it's, so it shouldn't be a surprise to us that God works this way.
Right, yes. God is not constrained by what militaries are going to have to worry about. He's not constrained by the technology or the number of people or any of these things. When he wants to deliver victory to someone, he delivers victory to them. I think Ai was instructive of that. When God had his hand against Israel, the people of Ai killed a lot of Israelites. And then when God gave victory to Israel, now they're able to easily conquer them. It's not really about their inherent ability. It's not about their military prowess. It's about God giving them victory or defeat, kind of based on their faithfulness here. So question number 3, what is God's direction for victory? Before we really get into like how they go and attack Midian, what is it that God just tells Gideon first to go and do?
Go to their camp and listen to a conversation.
Yeah, and even before that, but that comes very quickly on the heels of this. The first thing God says is, okay, go attack Midian. So, they're down to 300 people. And that direction for victory is, you're ready to fight. Go. And then, yes, immediately followed up by, but if you are afraid, which God knows that Gideon is afraid, then go down into the Midianite camp and hear what they have to say. Hear what's going on in the Midianite camp. So this is interesting because Gideon, remember, in chapter 6, already got 3 miracles showing that God is on his side, God is going to give him victory, and God still knows that Gideon is afraid. And so he is giving him another opportunity here to get some sign, to know that there's a way to overcome his fear and his doubt and to get his faith strong so that he really is able to go and fight. And I am always amazed at God's patience with his people as they are trying to seek him. God is giving Gideon every possible opportunity to succeed here. And that is the good God that we serve. So even though Gideon should have no excuse already, God gives him another help. Go on down, go listen to what they have to say. So yeah, this, does this require faith? Like, it did require faith, and Gideon's was still a little too weak, but that's how he's growing. So how does God build Gideon's faith when he goes down into the Midianite camp?
Gideon heard a man telling his companion about a dream,
Okay.
and the dream was a loaf of bread that hung over the camp of the Midianites and struck the camp and fell. He understood that to be false.
Yeah. So they're going down. Gideon doesn't even know what they're going down there for, what they're supposed to hear. I mean, the most plausible thing that comes to mind is we're going to scout out the camp and figure out where to go attack, I guess. A little bit like the spies going to scout out Jericho. He's going with his servant, and then he hears this dream. One of the Midianites is telling his companion, I just had the craziest dream. A loaf of bread rolled down the hillside and hit the tent, and the tent fell down. Now, what's really interesting is the Midianite knows what this dream means, which God has revealed this to the Midianite, because that is not at all clear to me that a loaf of bread rolling down a hillside means that Israel is going to defeat Midian. Now, Israel is kind of up on the hillside right now, and presumably Midian knows that. So there's a connection to be made there. And so they're imagining if something is coming down the hillside and hitting our tent and making it collapse, that, maybe you can connect the dots that way. But the Midianite does not seem even all that surprised by this. Like, this is such a crazy thing to imagine. After 7 years of them oppressing Israel, they know Gideon has assembled an army, but if they have any idea how many people he's got, they're not all that concerned. Even if all they know is the total number that Gideon was able to get at the beginning, that 32,000. They shouldn't be concerned about that. If the Midianite pretty matter-of-factly states, Israel's going to defeat us. And I can't see that any other way than God has revealed that to him, and that is being said more for Gideon's benefit than it is for the Midianite or that companion or anybody else. This is definitely a miraculous display that a revelation has been made to this Midianite for Gideon's benefit. So what's Gideon's reaction to that? Okay, so he worshipped. He knew, he says, this is now like the fourth time, but he said this, that I know that you are going to give us victory. I know that you are going to work by my hand and that we'll be able to defeat the Midianites. And he springs into action. He's ready to go. So after all of this time, after 4 different miracles in a relatively short span, after some difficult things that God has put Gideon through to get his faith working quickly, made him do a hard thing in tearing down his father's idol, made him face some opposition from his hometown so that he would get a bit of a backbone and get ready for this, and then reduced his number of men to really make Gideon think, this is not going to be by my hand and my prowess. It's going to be by God. Gideon is finally ready. They're ready to go attack Midian, and they're ready to win. So question number 5, why did Gideon and the people win against their enemies?
Because God gave them the rapture.
Yeah.
And the 300 charged into them, threw big fire into them, that the Midianites panicked and started fighting each other.
Yeah, so this is very clearly from God. The strategy they use, this was mentioned earlier, is that their primary weapons involved in this are not really swords and such, although they'll pull those out later. It's first that there's a torch covered up with a jar, and there's a trumpet in the other hand. And they're going to kind of get themselves around the Midianite army. And on the same cue, they break the jar so all the torches are suddenly visible, and blow the trumpets, and they're all going to shout. What is it they shout? I want you to pay attention to this. What is it they shout? Verse 18. Yeah, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Remember that. Hang on to that for a moment. Okay. So there's some practical component to this, right? Like, you would not normally put a torch into every soldier's hand. You would not normally put a trumpet into every soldier's hand. So this is a way of making it seem like a larger army than they really are. This is a way of confusing them. Normally, if you've got soldiers carrying torches, that's going to be visible from some distance away. This is at night, so you're going to be able to see a torch. They have people who are watching for the Israelites, ready for them to make some sort of attack. But they do this at the changing of the guard in the middle of the night, and they obscure these torches until just the proper moment. So this would be very unsettling to kind of, you're changing the guard, put yourself in one of these guards' shoes, right? One of these soldiers' shoes who's looking, you're just getting on shift to watch, and suddenly all around you, light, noise, shouts, and seemingly you are surrounded by a mighty army. That's a very frightening thing, and it gets them back on their heels quickly. Yes, sir.
On a 28-day cycle, the moon moves through a cycling,
Mhm.
and there are some nights that the moon is high and you can see for long distances. Then there are some times when the moon is not so bright and you can hardly see 30 feet.
Yeah.
And if they were to attack at night and they can only see 30 feet, and you have 10,000 people, and they can only see 10,000 feet, and they're expecting an army of 10,000,
Yeah.
but only 300 of the most valiant decided to show up for the battle.
Yeah.
But they don't know where the enemy is, and start thinking that these other guys are, especially when there's 100,000 of them, and they couldn't possibly know who each other is. But if there's 300 of us bunched together, we all know who the 300 of us are, enough in order to recognize it's not to kill each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can imagine that.
Yeah.
Very easily.
Like I said, normally you wouldn't have a torch in every single soldier's hands. You expect for every torch you see, there's more soldiers too, right? And so it's unclear, like, where are the enemies? Where are we? It's the middle of the night, so most of the soldiers are still asleep. Everyone's waking up to all this confusion. And yeah, as has been mentioned, they start fighting themselves. They don't even know who's friend and who's foe. They end up really killing a lot of their own men. And so the Israelites are just staying put. They've not rushed in yet. They've not gone to fight them. As far as we can tell, they've not even drawn their swords, and there's already massive carnage in the camp.
Like the horns are going off.
Yeah.
The horns are going off. It's like every time you're driving down the road, and the next thing you know, you hear the sirens behind you, the cops behind you, and you're like, oops,
Yeah.
I was doing 7 miles over the speed
Yeah.
limit. I didn't need anything. But
Yeah.
then you realize you forgot your seatbelt too, and that's right, your citation. You get all panicked. You hear the siren.
Yeah.
You hear these trumpets going off. Jars of Greek fire being thrown at tents. Fire everywhere.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it's panic and chaos.
Yeah.
And the 300 know who they are, but the enemy's like 100,000 people.
Yeah.
They don't know who
They
each
don't know.
other is. They presume that those guys over there might be the enemy.
Yeah.
Especially on a dark night where they can only see 30 feet.
Right. And they believe, they're probably already in the camp, already attacking us. And now once some of them have drawn their swords, now as you're bleary-eyed and, waking up in the middle of the night and you see a figure who's got a sword out, you think, this is an Israelite who's come to kill me. And so you quickly draw yours and now you're fighting. And yeah, there's mass chaos. This is a tool that God uses in many of the battles in sowing confusion among the enemies. This is not the first time that we've seen God do that. He is able to foil their discipline, foil their skill. When God has decided that they are going to lose, they are absolutely going to lose. There's no way for them to get around that. It's not going to be a pitched battle, Midian versus Israel. It's going to be God wreaking havoc among them and Israel cleaning up. So this is a very frightening thing for all of them, would be a terrifying but amazing sight for Israel as well. Imagine, I know how timid and, maybe not timid, but how just nervous they must have felt, knowing there's only 300 of us and we're around this big camp, and if they see what we're doing, they're going to come squash us like bugs. But that doesn't happen. And they're just standing there. They're blowing their trumpets. They're calling out, crying for the Lord and for Gideon. And they see the camp falling before them. There's strong parallels here to God making the walls of Jericho fall down as they were standing around. Lauren? Yeah, absolutely. It's God who is doing this. Now, I want to talk about this for the Lord and for Gideon thing, because we can miss this. This is a common construction that was used in ancient times that soldiers would say in battle, others would say at different times. It's basically, if you want to generalize it, for God and for king. Foreshadowing, okay? So, for God and for king. So they go out into battle, for Baal and for, whatever king or prince it is that they're fighting under. That's like this show of respect for the leaders who are leading them into battle. They would believe it's their God and their king who's doing this. And then also just the way of trying to bring terror to their enemies. So when the Israelites say, for the Lord and for Gideon, it just makes us think. And if chapter 8 didn't happen, then I think you could brush this off. And you could say, well, this is just, they're recognizing Gideon's their leader. But chapter 8 does exist. And so it's going to bring some problems up. That Gideon kind of establishes himself as king. And that's going to cause some issues. What else do you have to say about chapter 7?
That phrase, though, does it make it sound like on the same level?
Yeah, it kind of does, I think, And again, this is one of those, in isolation, you could probably explain it away, but it's not in isolation. They would, kind of put their God and their king together like this. And the Israelites are already exhibiting a pagan practice in doing this and already elevating Gideon in some way. This is really the first worrisome sign we have in chapter 7 that things are going to go wrong after the battle is over. And Gideon changes quite a bit as we get into chapter 8 as well. What else do you think about any of this? Yeah, Mark.
We had reinforcements come along afterward as well, and they were chasing them. You see later on in the chapter, it said Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim saying, come down against the Midianites. So it wasn't just 300 guys.
Right.
As this battle progressed, they got help.
Yeah. Now Israel is rising up to add to the number. Gideon was able to assemble, those 32,000 men to start with. There were a lot of people who were not even willing to go and be a part of that number. But now that Gideon's got some momentum, now that there's been a great victory and the Midianites are running for their lives, now there are more people who are willing to come and fight. And so they're coming out of their towns, out of their villages. Gideon's sending messengers all throughout anywhere nearby saying, come to arms, come and chase the Midianites. Let's finish them off and we can be free from them. So yeah, the whole battle does not consist just of the 300 men against the Midianites. More are involved. And that is a good thing. I don't think that's any lack of faith on Gideon's part. The victory has clearly been given to them by God, and Gideon has done what he was supposed to do. Now in recruiting more to go and to finish the job, this is a good thing. This is similar to what we've seen in some of the other accounts of the judges, where there would be the assassination of an enemy and then calling for more Israelites to come and to fight. Ehud did that, if you remember. He kills Eglon, and now he's able to get their enemies kind of on the back foot. And now he goes and he tells Israel, rise up, let's go and free ourselves from these enemies. God has given us the victory. Gideon's doing that same sort of thing. Ephraim in particular here is going to come up in chapter 8. In chapter 7, verse 24, we see Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites and capture the waters against them, as far as Bethbara and also the Jordan. And the men of Ephraim do rise up and do this. They're going to have some complaints in chapter 8 that Gideon has to navigate, but they are part of this, and that will become important as well. Final thoughts or questions? Yeah, Betty. Yeah.
So gross to me and how thought people do that.
Yeah, it's a violent affair, Alan.
It makes me think it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the Lord.
Yeah.
That's what it makes me think.
Absolutely. And when Gideon is delivering the people, they're getting this great victory, like it is a bloody affair. There's a lot of people who are dying. There's a lot of carnage, and this follows the trend that we've seen in Judges of some pretty graphic depictions of the deaths of leaders, and that's par for the course at this point. They're working great wickedness, and they're oppressing Israel, and they fall in some very bloody and dishonorable ways. So we'll see that in chapter 8 next week as we kind of conclude the Gideon saga of how he's going to fall. I keep teasing it for you here and foreshadowing it. Gideon's going to fall really, really hard in chapter 8. And I need us to appreciate and understand that as we go through, because this is a major turning point in the book of Judges that we need to understand. So be ready for that next week. Thanks.